Well, I thought I'd do a video today on the Pontiac that was never produced, but certainly inspired a number of Pontiacs in the years after it was announced. And what I'm talking about is the 1988 Pontiac Banshee IV concept. Now, the Banshee IV concept, the 4 obviously means that there were other Banshees that preceded it. And the first Pontiac Banshee was introduced in 1964 as a concept, the General Motors XP833, that kind of later got the name Banshee. This was a 2-seat sports car that John DeLorean, at the time, was the head of Pontiac Motor Division. He really wanted something to compete with the likes of the Chevrolet Corvette. But as you can imagine, that went down in flames as Chevrolet was not about to have Pontiac compete with its Corvette, which had all of the performance that General Motors could muster. The Corvette had to remain the top performance car at General Motors and would do so. And thus the Pontiac Banshee from 1964 was just put out to pasture and wasn't further explored. But by 1988, Pontiac Motor Division was really trying to get back into that excitement theme. And actually, this was a pretty successful time period for Pontiac during the late 1980s. They still had the Fiero, which the sales were admittedly on the wane, but certainly looked good in the 1988 model year, its ultimate model year. You also had the redesigned Pontiac Bonneville that would come out for the 1987 model year. That handsome vehicle was based off of the other C&H body cars that were introduced in 1985 and 1986 by sister divisions Buick, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac. And of course, you still had the 6000 soldiering on from 1982 to this point, including the STE versions. My favorite, of course, the Sunbird, the J car. And you had the Pontiac Firebird, which, by the way, the Firebird that would come out in the early 1990s would take a lot of cues from the Pontiac Banshee. But more on that in a minute. In any case, the late 1980s, as I said, was really a good time for Pontiac. Some of its best sales years, in fact. Hard to believe. Even better sales years than 1968, as an example, which was, I think, the second best sales year for Pontiac. In any case, in the late 1980s, Pontiac was looking for a concept car to show the buying public that was really leaning forward into its We Build Excitement image that the division had conjured up in recent years. And it was felt that a new concept car was what was needed in order to showcase this to the buying public. Thus, a number of sketches were worked out and various proposals were contemplated. But at the end of the day, the Pontiac Banshee IV concept was the result. You can see this beautiful sketch done by Tom Peters. This, I believe, was done after the car's design was really conceived. You notice that the date here is December of 1987. And the car was nearing the auto show circuit by this point in time. But Tom was really responsible for the design theme for the Pontiac Banshee exterior. And for those who don't know, Tom was certainly a hotshot designer of the time and for many years subsequently at General Motors. And he principally worked on Corvettes for a number of years, including the C6, the C7, even did full-size trucks for a period of time, as well as Camaros. So Tom's a super talented individual, but the Pontiac Banshee has to be one of my favorites of Tom's designs. And his sketches were and are known across the industry as being some of the best produced. Now, after the sketch phase, it went on to the car construction phase and the clay model. And you can actually see Tom here in front of the clay model of the Banshee back in the early days. But one of the things that I think that Pontiac designers were really looking for during this time frame was to get away from that boxy look that General Motors cars had in the 1980s with that very vertical C-pillar, the so-called 3-box design that was very prominent with the hood, the midsection, and the trunk. It was a successful design language for General Motors, but GM design was really smarting from that Fortune automobile cover that was produced in the early 1980s that showed all of the A-body cars lined up. That was something that GM designers during this time period could never forget. They were so embarrassed by the fact that so many of their cars looked alike. And by the way, it wasn't because of the bean counters. If you look at those A-body cars, they have unique hoods, fenders, deck lids, quarter panels, doors. There's a lot of unique sheet metal. The glass and the roof panels and the A-pillars are the same. But unfortunately, the designers just kind of kept using that theme over and over and over again because it was so successful in the 76 to 79 Seville that they tried to basically translate it to almost everything except sporty cars. And at this point, the Ford Taurus had come out in 1986, and it showed that American consumers wanted something different than that typical three-box look that was patterned off of the 76 to 79 Seville. And also by this point, General Motors had changed leadership at its design staff. Irv Ribicki had retired, and Chuck Jordan was the new vice president of design at General Motors in 1986, and he decreed that beauty was going to be back in design. And so you see a lot of these concept cars that come out in the late 80s, early 90s from General Motors that are really trying to bring beauty back as Chuck Jordan was attempting to make his mark over at General Motors Design. And thus, the era of beauty came to Pontiac in the form of the Pontiac Banshee IV that you see here. Now, one of the things that I will say about this is, as compared to previous cars, you notice that there's really hardly any sharp creases on this car, and the car is really dictated by its overall form language. You do have a few creases, like in the middle of the vehicle, just in front of that black area that forms the hood, as well as some creases around the side and the wings, etc. But if you look at this, the form is really the shape of the car. It's almost one of these so-called no-line cars with no creases, and a car where the silhouette effectively forms the overall design. This was, needless to say, a dramatic departure from General Motors design at the time, and a harbinger of the direction that GM design was going to go in. This was really the direction that many of the younger designers wanted to take design in. They were tired of that three-box design and wanted to do something novel. And I think the Banshee was certainly novel for its day, and gosh, it still looks good. This is a 1988 concept, conceived a few years before that. And here we are almost 40 years later, and the thing still makes eyes, let's say, move and jaws drop. Now, the other thing about the Banshee is its proportions. It has really interesting proportions because the hood line is so low and the deck is so high with so much glass, you can't really tell if it's a mid-engine car or a front-engine car. It is, in fact, a front-engine car. We'll talk a little bit more about the engine under hood in a second because it was a pretty novel technology that GM employed for that engine. But I just love how the designers incorporated the Pontiac Arrowhead there into the front end as well as the hood. That very classic style. Really isn't much of a split grille here. I guess there kind of is one, but that's certainly not the dominant theme that had been the dominant theme of Pontiacs back to 1959. You do get kind of this wasp-waisted style vehicle where the body bulges out over the front wheel as well as the rear wheel. Notice the car is wider around the wheels in section than it is around the door. So it has this athletic proportion that kind of pushes the glass planes inboard of the wheels and gives it more of an athletic stance. Now, out back, we just talked about glass planes, and well, this car is basically one big glass plane all the way around. There is kind of the basket handle that you can see there that runs over top of the roof. And but aside from that, one of the things I love about the concept cars of this era is just this open, glassy, airy feel that they have, something that you don't get in cars today. And I think that, frankly, kind of sucks. Whenever you're sitting in a modern car, you have these chunky A pillars and B pillars and C pillars, and in some cases D pillars on the SUVs that really obstruct your vision. And I get why it's done because of rollover standards, but I think that you would use the ability to see around you a lot more frequently than the protection, let's say, in a rollover. I mean, every time you change lanes, it's a great thing to be able to see. And this car, you notice, doesn't have the typical outside rear view mirrors or even door handles. That kind of functionality was handled through some elements of the interior and various screens in the interior. Now, you can also see the trademark of the Banshee, these kind of dual wings that are hiding the tail lamps underneath them. The exhaust tips are also hidden. They're way tucked in, way underneath the kind of, or at the lower portion of the fascia here. And the other thing I will point out is notice this car really has kind of a shoulder that runs along the entire vehicle. You can see the shoulder as it is formed at the top of the fender and then continues on into the door where it becomes a little bit more narrow. And then obviously the whole rear kind of is one big shoulder with these double wings. Just a fantastic looking design. And with that shoulder and wasp waist, I don't know, for me, some of that reminds me of the 1968 Dodge Charger that has that beautiful shoulder that runs all the way around it and also has a similar wasp-waisted, let's say, proportion to it. Just fantastic. And another signature of the Banshee design is just the silhouette. And as I said, you really can't tell if this is a mid-engine car or a front-engine car because the hood is just so low and the backlight is so big, it looks like you'd almost have the engine back there. But, of course, this is front engine. I always thought that the wheel forms here and the wheel arches were kind of interesting. This kind of squircle-style design and the back being semi-skirted. I thought that it was just, a cool look. And you have the Pontiac 3-spoke wheel here. That would be something that would become a brand characteristic for Pontiac in subsequent years, those 3-spoke wheels. Here you see it in an early 1988 Banshee. You can also see how that wing is formed just by the shoulder that starts partway through the door and then continues back, and eventually it separates from the quarter. Just a fantastic looking car. You can also notice that the designers blacked out the A-pillars. They left the basket handle that goes over top of the car, but they wanted this look, I think, of just complete glass out front. If you could make that a total canopy, my guess is that that's probably what that would be. Of course, then you wouldn't be able to get into the car very easily. And, well, you have to be able to get into your Banshee so that you can look kind of cool. Now, as you look at the interior of the Banshee, you have to remember that this was a time frame during which Pontiac was really in love with buttons on the steering wheel and buttons with close placement to your fingers when you were driving. And you can see that philosophy espoused on the Banshee here. There's quite a few steering wheel buttons. We'll take a look at them more up close. One of the things I always thought was funky in this car was the manual shifter. Just had this strange proportion. It's very erect, shall I say. It's kind of bizarre. But that's how it was designed. The seats were split into two pieces, and so there actually are back seats here. This is a 2+2 configuration, although I have a feeling that if you were sitting in the back seat, you'd probably get pretty hot because the sun is beating down on you. But hey, this is a concept. And in order to improve the entry into the rear seat, the top portion of the seat, of the front seat, swivels out of the way, which I thought was a novel idea. And the seat belts are integrated into the overall seat design. Here's a better close-up of the interior, and you can see what I mean with the steering wheel buttons. This was a tilt and telescoping wheel on here, and it's kind of a modern-day squarish style wheel, something that's come back in vogue. The car also had heads-up display. Remember, General Motors owned Hughes at this time that made a lot of aircraft technology, and so they employed it here on the Banshee. Heads-up displays would be something that would become rather common on General Motors cars from the late 1980s forward, at least for a few years. And you can see that shifter, the manual shifter again, it almost looks like a goblin or a ghost or something wearing a cape. I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but in any case, I just find it humorous. Now, under hood in the Banshee was this 4-liter V8 that allegedly was double overhead cam and was an integral block and head design. Pretty controversial and novel for the time. And reports differ, but it produced between 210 and 230 horsepower. Before you say, well, kind of poo-poo that, remember, cresting 200 horsepower in the late 1980s was a pretty big feat. There were not many cars that were able to do that. But there really wasn't much that happened after this Banshee experimental engine in terms of the integral block and head design. Today you have integral head and exhaust manifolds, but I can't think of a modern-day engine, perhaps somebody can put it in the comments, that has an integral block and head. But that's what was done here, and I guess it worked. It was paired with a 5-speed manual transmission, and I'm sure that this car had pretty zippy performance overall. So what do you think of the 1988 Pontiac Banshee? To me, this is one of my favorite concepts of all time, one of my favorite General Motors concept cars that was produced. I think it still looks awesome. I love the design. It still looks cool. It's still jaw-dropping almost 40 years later. It's hard to believe, but kudos to General Motors designers who put this together. Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.